So how do we define this then? We've set up what it potentially is. We've looked at some literature. How do you define this? Well, we're going to go back to a paper published by Richard Budgett in the British Journal of Sports Medicine back in 1999. And it's actually the best definition to use. Unexplained underperformance syndrome is a persistent yet unexplained performance deficit which is recognised and agreed by the coach and the athlete despite 2 weeks of relative rest. In other words, performance decreases, it's persistent, but we don't know why. Okay, we don't know why. So if we can't really explain it from kind of first principles, in other words, well, the athlete has suddenly become sleep deprived for whatever reason. Well, that would potentially explain it. Or they have gone. Maybe they're in an athlete in Ramadan. So in Ramadan, there are clearly big implications in terms of being able to eat from sunrise to sundown, and also to drink, and actually that can have quite significant effects on performance. But we know we can explain that. That's likely to explain what's going on. If we can't explain this, then it fits the characterization of unexplained underperformance syndrome. And that is very much at the heart of what is going on here. Now, if we take this, which is published from the European College of Sports Sciences, a position statement, it kind of starts to set this in tone for us. So what we have here, we have kind of our schematic, and we've got this training area here. So this is kind of the ideal training block, right? So we've got intensified training, we get an acute fatigue. It may take days to recover, depending on the kind of training we do. We might be doing overload training or crash or shock cycle training. But the net result is there should be an increase in performance. Now, though, we start to get into this spectrum of response, which will start to break down as we go further in, which is this notion, as was referred to in that paper which was on the English youth athletes, of what is called functional overreaching or non-functional overreaching. So what we see is in the functional, it seems to take days to weeks to recover from. So it's fundamentally the same things are happening. We're getting a fatigue response, but rather than taking a matter of hours to days to recover, we're looking at days to weeks. The net result is you get a decrease in performance. And the best example that you can use here is when you take an athlete on a training camp. Like we saw in the Costill study a moment ago, on a training camp, we generally take an athlete and we really intensify the training. We try to do that because we're trying to create a crash mesocycle within the training plan. We're trying to basically evoke quite significant changes in the fatigue-based response. Well, we would expect performance to decrease because they're more fatigued, but what should happen is that overall performance will bounce back if we give an appropriate amount of recovery. If we go to what's called non-functional, it can actually take weeks to months. And what we start to see is that we don't get the bounce back, that they become stagnated. We'll talk about stagnation in a moment as we look at another schematic. They start to become stagnated, and so the net result is that performance doesn't bounce back. So that is an underperformance response. This is underperformance, but I could explain this. They're still functional, but I could explain this, right? Because I know what's caused it. I may not know what's caused this. It doesn't, as we've said previously, just mean that they've trained too much or had too little recovery. And then they've labelled it overtraining syndrome, which is what we're calling really the correct phrasing, because it's not about just training too hard, underperformance syndrome. But this is the important part. It may be months to never recovering. And that's the really important part. You may never recover from this. If you fall into this category, it's very much not just the end of kind of sporting capability, but actually has enormous ramifications on somebody's underlying health. So not surprisingly, there's an enormous decrease in performance, to the point where most athletes who are at the extreme of this don't get out of bed. Okay, it's an incredibly debilitating kind of condition. So if we just look at this schematic, just to kind of reinforce what we're getting at here. So we've got this basic spectrum of response. They, again, using some phrasing which we're going to reflect on as we go through. But we've gone from undertraining to an acute overload, which is what we'd expect to do when we train athletes correctly. to overreaching. So this is kind of maybe what we were talking about with the functional. So you're pushing the athlete harder than perhaps they would do doing a kind of progressive overload that we see here. Okay, but fundamentally you will recover in a few days to a few weeks. But then if we go into what they've called overtraining, and this is why I want the taxonomy to be really clear. I mean, this comes from a paper, but we've learned, right, that actually it's not about just overtraining, doing too much. It's about underperformance. Well, actually, that's what they're referring to. We start to get these maladaptations. So we start to get negative physiological, metabolic, morphological, immunological, psychological responses. The net result is you get a decrease in performance, and as we've already referred to, it could be weeks to months to never even recovering. So how does this kind of work? Well, we go back to Richard Budgett, again, published this time in the International Journal of Sports Medicine. And what they show you is this kind of cycle. So what we have is, we have athletes, or any athlete, whether it's recreational or elite, and they will do hard training or they'll be competing. And the net result is that we know that we apply a stress on the body. That's the whole notion of training, that you apply stress. The stress that you apply is done to exceed the homeostatic set point. So fundamentally, you create a stress on homeostasis for those biological, morphological, physiological systems. By doing that, you create the fatigue response, and the fatigue response is what should generate the biological adaptation. But here's where it gets quite interesting. When we do that, not surprisingly, if I was to measure performance in that fatigue zone, so after the training, while the athlete is recovering, guess what? Performance will be decreased. So what do? Well, we enforce rest, which should give us recovery. We'll come back to the word partial in a moment, and then we train again. But remember that we don't ever really go for full recovery with athletes. It's quite difficult, particularly at the elite level, where we may be training twice a day. Some athletes may be training 3 times a day. And that's where it becomes cyclical. Because you train, the net result of the training is you apply the stress and you get the fatigue. Now what happens here is really important. Because you've caused the stress, we know, and we know this if you go back and look at the session, which is the sessional theories and models of training, and you go and look at Sale's original idea, which was the idea of the stress response, and he was looking at what he called the alarm reaction. People are more susceptible to infection because of that stress that's being placed on the body. So you get a performance decrement and now more susceptible to infection, so we enforce rest. But the net result is, in athletes, we don't ever get full recovery, it's partial. So we now start in a more fatigued state. Now we apply the stress again, we get more fatigue, we're now even more susceptible to illness and infection. And this cycle keeps going round and round and round. And so when we start to get into a cycle whereby fundamentally the recovery isn't enough to allow for a complete removal of the fatigue, a complete resetting of the immune response, the net result is they are in this cyclical based scenario where they become more and more susceptible to illness and infection. So within that, we then get to this notion, which was first addressed on that schematic from the European College of Sports Sciences, which is what is the difference between functional and being functionally and non-functionally underperforming, or functionally, non-functionally overreached. And these are quite important distinctions. Well, it's based upon the duration of the symptoms. And also it's based upon the fact that in functional, really we are able to carry on, we're able to carry on exercising. Non-functional, we start to see quite significant changes in performance. So recovery to normal performance should occur within days to weeks. That's functional overreaching. So that's the classic training camp. You put an athlete in a really hard period of training, an overload period of training. Yes, they're going to be fatigued. Yes, performance is going to decline at that moment. But if we offer actually the appropriate amount of recovery, you get the supercompensatory effect, you get the bounce back. But in the non-functionally overreaching, it's several weeks to months. And so the notion of overtraining syndrome or underperformance syndrome could be months to years. And these are on a spectrum. You can move from functional to non-functional. It's unlikely that you just drop in at non-functional. It's kind of a spectrum of a response, and then that leads to underperformance syndrome. And then beyond that, what's recognized is that you've got to kind of check in on athletes. And one of the big things that will come from this lesson, and one of the take-home messages, is tracking and monitoring athletes to make sure that we prevent the athlete going too far. If we get them functionally overreached, that's okay if we're trying to deliberately do that, or that we recognize it. When we start to get non-functionally overreached, we're now in a situation where we've got to just back the athlete off, not for a short period of time, but actually for weeks to months. And think about the implications of that in terms of performance, and particularly at the elite level, in terms of well-being and so on. And if we don't take any account of any of these, we end up in the situation where we go to classically overtraining syndrome, or what we're now referring to as underperformance syndrome. Now, this is perhaps the best representation of all of these, which is combining our two previous schematics into one perhaps more seamless representation. And so what you have here is kind of our timeline of responses. So if we undertrain our athletes, that is, we don't exceed the homeostatic level for any of the biological systems we want to train, you'll get no adaptation. It's an undertraining based effect. If, though, we come into this positive training zone, in a positive training zone, what we should get is biological adaptation. And that is because we are pushing beyond the homeostatic level to drive adaptation. Remember, we've got to then induce fatigue. The fatigue, then, if we have the appropriate recovery, you get the supercompensation effect. And the net result is that we will get recovery. But where it starts to get interesting is when we move in this zone. And one of the things that starts to happen is there is a potential for athlete boredom. Now, athlete boredom doesn't necessarily mean that you automatically move down this scale, but it has a part to play. If athletes become bored with the training, one of the things that tends to happen is that we tend to modify the training to compensate for that. And when we start to modify the training, we start to compromise what we're doing in terms of training loads and training volumes. And that has the potential to push the athlete down this scale. You don't have to be bored to move on this scale, but it's worth recognizing that that is there. They've then referred to this whole section here as the overtraining response continuum. Let's reword that amongst ourselves as the underperformance response continuum. Because all of these are the same metrics, it's just the wording, the taxonomy that's changed. So we go into what is called overreached state, or sympathetic staleness. Now, we'll get into the difference between sympathetic and parasympathetic in a moment, but overreaching is really that kind of functional response we were talking to earlier on, which is that we take an athlete on a training camp, we get a significant fatigue-based response, performance goes down, but actually you give them a little bit of time to recover, they bounce back. And it is kind of a short-term acute response. But if we don't listen to the athlete, we don't listen to their body, you move from this kind of sympathetic into a parasympathetic-based staleness. And this becomes kind of problematic because the recovery then becomes longer term. And then we get into the notion of burnout. Now, burnout is very, very different to staleness. And in fact, a stale athlete is potentially more dangerous than a burnt out athlete. And that's because what is understood is that an athlete that would be defined as stale is an athlete whereby performance has decreased. But what they are doing is they are still training. And they're either training in a training camp, they're training really hard, or they're training harder than perhaps they really should be because fundamentally they can't explain why performance is decreasing. And so they think, well, actually, perhaps I'm not training hard enough. And so this kind of whole zone here of the overreached from the kind of the sympathetic to the parasympathetic, but staleness is a very dangerous athlete to have. They're getting decreases in performance, they can't explain it, they train harder. Whereas the burnt out athlete is very much right on the precipice of being the underperformance athlete. Because the burnt out athlete has gone through all of these stages. They're no longer really pushing themselves hard. We're starting to see a decrease in motivation. Motivation here is high. Okay, the athlete is not motivated here. So we can pull them back, but it's a long-term response. This is a months and months to pull them back. If you've got an athlete who's just really lacking motivation, but is still training, so athletes who aren't particularly motivated can still be made to train, I suppose. They move from burnt out to underperformance syndrome, and then we've gone off the cliff edge, metaphorically. But we've also gone off the edge there in terms of physiologically and metabolically and psychologically. So this is a really important explanation of that kind of continuation of response.